Everything you've ever wanted to know about Battle of the Bulge, read in full from Wikipedia. Stick around to the end. Let's begin. The Battle of the Bulge was an offensive campaign on the Western Front during the Second World War, taking place from 16th December 1944 to 25th January 1945. It was launched through the densely forested Ardennes region of eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, and was intended to stop Allied use of the Belgian port of Antwerp and to split the Allied lines, allowing the Germans to encircle and destroy each of the four Allied armies and force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace treaty in the Axis powers' favour. The Germans achieved a total surprise attack on the morning of 16th of December 1944 due to a combination of Allied overconfidence based on the favourable defensive terrain and faulty intelligence about Wehrmacht intentions, poor aerial reconnaissance due to bad weather, and a preoccupation with Allied offensive plans elsewhere. American forces were using this region primarily as a rest area for the US First Army, and the lines were thinly held by fatigued troops and inexperienced replacement units. The Germans also took advantage of heavily overcast weather conditions that grounded the Allies' superior air forces for an extended period. American resistance on the northern shoulder of the offensive, around Elsenborn Ridge, and in the south, around Bastogne, blocked German access to key roads to the northwest and west, which they had counted on for success. This congestion and terrain that favoured the defenders threw the German advance behind schedule and allowed the Allies to reinforce the thinly placed troops. The farthest west the offensive reached was the village of Foy-Notre-Dame, southeast of Dinant, being stopped by the US 2nd Armoured Division on 24th December 1944. Improved weather conditions from around 24 December permitted air attacks on German forces and supply lines. On 26 December, the lead element of General George S. Patton's US Third Army reached Bastogne from the south, ending the siege. Although the offensive was effectively broken by 27 December, when the trapped units of 2nd Panzer Division made two breakout attempts with only partial success, the battle continued for another month before the front line was effectively restored to its position prior to the attack. The Germans committed over 410,000 men, just over 1,400 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, 2,600 artillery pieces, and over 1,000 combat aircraft. Between 63,000 and 104,000 of these men were killed, missing, wounded in action, or captured. The battle severely depleted Germany's armoured forces, which remained largely unreplaced throughout the remainder of the war. German Luftwaffe personnel, and later also Luftwaffe aircraft, in the concluding stages of the engagement, also sustained heavy losses. In the wake of the defeat, many experienced German units were effectively out of men and equipment, and the survivors retreated to the Siegfried Line. Allied forces eventually came to more than 700,000 men. From these, there were from 77,000 to more than 83,000 casualties, including at least 8,600 killed. The Bulge was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. It was one of the most important battles of the war, as it marked the last major offensive attempted by the Axis powers on the Western Front. After this defeat, Nazi forces would only retreat for the remainder of the war. Background: after the breakout from Normandy at the end of July 1944 and the Allied landings in southern France on 15th of August 1944, the Allies advanced towards Germany more quickly than anticipated. The speed of the advance of the Allies caused several military logistics issues. Troops were fatigued by weeks of continuous combat and rapid movement. Supply lines were stretched extremely thin. Supplies were dangerously depleted. By December 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander on the Western Front, and his staff decided to hold the Ardennes region primarily as a rest area for the US First Army, with limited Allied operational objectives in the area. The Allies defended the Ardennes line very thinly, due to the favourable defensive terrain, a densely wooded highland with deep river valleys and a rather thin road network, and because they had intelligence that the Wehrmacht was using the area across the German border as a rest and refit area for its own troops. Allied supply issues. The Allies faced major supply issues due to the rate of their advance coupled with the initial lack of deep water ports. Over-the-beach supply operations using the Normandy landing areas and direct landing ships on the beaches were unable to meet operational needs. The only deep water port the Allies had captured was Cherbourg on the northern shore of the Cotentin Peninsula, and west of the original invasion beaches. But the Germans had thoroughly wrecked and mined the harbour before it could be taken. It took many months to rebuild its cargo handling capability. The Allies captured the port of Antwerp intact in the first days of September, but it was not operational until 28 November. The estuary of the Schelde River that controlled access to the port had to be cleared of both German troops and naval mines. These limitations led to differences between General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the Anglo-Canadian 21st Army Group, over whether Montgomery, or Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the US 12th Army Group, in the south would get priority access to supplies. German forces remained in control of several major ports on the English Channel coast into the autumn, while Dunkirk remained under siege until the end of the war in May 1945. The Allies' efforts to destroy the French railway system prior to D-Day were successful. This destruction hampered the German response to the invasion, but it proved equally hampering to the Allies, as it took time to repair the rail network's tracks and bridges. A trucking system nicknamed the Red Ball Express brought supplies to frontline troops, but used up 5 times as much fuel to reach the front line near the Belgian border. By early October, the Allies had suspended major offensives to improve their supply lines and supply availability at the front. Montgomery and Bradley both pressed for priority delivery of supplies to their respective armies, so they could continue their individual lines of advance and maintain pressure on the Germans, while Eisenhower preferred a broad front strategy. He gave some priority to Montgomery's northern forces. This had the short-term goal of opening the urgently needed port of Antwerp, and the long-term goal of capturing the Ruhr area, the biggest industrial area of Germany. With the Allies stalled, German General Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was able to reorganize the disrupted German armies into a coherent defensive force. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Market Garden had achieved only some of its objectives, while its territorial gains left the Allied supply situation stretched further than before. In October, the 1st Canadian Army fought the Battle of the Scheldt, opening the port of Antwerp to shipping. As a result, by the end of October, the supply situation had eased somewhat. German plans. Despite a lull along the front after the Scheldt battles, the German situation remained dire. While operations continued in the autumn, notably the Lorraine campaign, the Battle of Aachen and fighting in the Hürtgen forest, the strategic situation in the west had changed little. The Allies were slowly pushing towards Germany, but no breakthrough was achieved. There were 96 Allied divisions at or near the front, with an estimated 10 more divisions on the way from the United Kingdom. Additional Allied airborne units remained in England. The Germans could field a total of 55 understrength divisions. Adolf Hitler first outlined his planned counteroffensive to his generals on 16th of September 1944. The goal was to pierce the thinly held lines of the US First Army between Monschau and Wasserbillig, with General Feldmarschall Walter Model's Army Group B by the end of the first day, get the armour through the Ardennes by the end of the second day, reach the Meuse between Liège and Dinant by the third day, and seize Antwerp and the western bank of the Scheldt estuary by the fourth day. Hitler initially promised his generals a total of 18 infantry and 12 armoured or mechanised divisions for planning purposes. The plan was to pull 13 infantry divisions, 2 parachute divisions and 6 armoured divisions from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Strategic Reserve. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets' Operation Bagration during the summer had destroyed much of Germany's Army Group Center, Heeresgruppe Mitte. By November, it was clear that Soviet forces were preparing for a winter offensive. The Allied air offensive of early 1944 had grounded the Luftwaffe, leaving the German army with little battlefield intelligence and no way to interdict Allied supplies. The converse was equally damaging. Daytime movement of German forces was rapidly noticed, and attacks on supplies combined with the bombing of the Romanian oil fields starved Germany of oil and gasoline. This fuel shortage intensified after the Soviets overran those fields in the course of their second Jassy-Kishinev offensive in August 1944. One of the few advantages held by the German forces in November 1944 was that they were no longer defending all of Western Europe. Their front lines in the west had been considerably shortened by the Allied offensive and were much closer to the German heartland. This drastically reduced their supply problems despite Allied control of the air. The extensive telephone and telegraph network meant that radios were no longer necessary for communications, which lessened the effectiveness of Allied Ultra intercepts. Some 40-50 messages per day were decrypted by Ultra. They recorded the quadrupling of German fighter forces, and a term used in an intercepted Luftwaffe message, Jägeraufmarsch, literally, fighter deployment, implied preparation for an offensive operation. Ultra also picked up communiques regarding extensive rail and road movements in the region, as well as orders that movements should be made on time, drafting the offensive. Hitler felt that his mobile reserves allowed him to mount one offensive. Although he realized nothing significant could be accomplished in the Eastern Front, he still believed an offensive against the Western Allies, whom he considered militarily inferior to the Red Army, would have some chances of success. Hitler believed he could split the Allied forces and compel the Americans and British to settle for a separate peace, independent of the Soviet Union. Success in the West would give the Germans time to design and produce more advanced weapons, such as jet aircraft, new U-boat designs and super-heavy tanks, and permit the concentration of forces in the East. After the war ended, this assessment was generally viewed as unrealistic, given Allied air superiority throughout Europe and their ability continually to disrupt German offensive operations. Hitler's plan called for a blitzkrieg attack through the weakly defended Ardennes, mirroring the successful German offensive there during the Battle of France in 1940, and aimed at splitting the armies along the US-British lines and capturing Antwerp. The plan banked on unfavorable weather, including thick fog and low-lying clouds, which would minimize the Allied air advantage. Hitler originally set the offensive for late November, before the anticipated start of the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive. The disputes between Montgomery and Bradley were well known, and Hitler hoped he could exploit this disunity. If the attack were to succeed in capturing Antwerp, 4 armies would be trapped without supplies behind German lines. Several senior German military officers, including General Feldmarschalls Model and von Rundstedt, expressed concern as to whether the goals of the offensive could be realized. Model and von Rundstedt both believed aiming for Antwerp was too ambitious, given Germany's scarce resources in late 1944. At the same time, they felt that maintaining a purely defensive posture, as had been the case since Normandy, would only delay defeat, not avert it. They thus developed alternative, less ambitious plans that did not aim to cross the Meuse River, in German and Dutch, Maas. Models being Unternehmen Herbstnebel, Operation Autumn Mist, and von Rundstedt's Fall Martin, Plan Martin. The 2 field marshals combined their plans to present a joint small solution to Hitler. When they offered their alternative plans, Hitler would not listen. Rundstedt later testified that while he recognized the merit of Hitler's operational plan, he saw from the very first that absolutely all conditions for the possible success of such an offensive were lacking. Model, commander of German Army Group B, Heeresgruppe B, and von Rundstedt, overall commander of the German Army Command in the West, OB West, were put in charge of carrying out the operation. The positions of the Allied armies stretched from southern France all the way north to the Netherlands. German planning for the counteroffensive rested on the premise that an attack against thinly manned stretches of the line would halt Allied advances on the Western Front. Operation names. The Wehrmacht's code name for the offensive was Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, after the German patriotic hymn Die Wacht am Rhein, a name that deceptively implied the Germans would be adopting a defensive posture along the Western Front. The Germans also referred to it as Ardennes Offensive, Ardennes Offensive, and Rundstedt Offensive, both names being generally used nowadays in modern Germany. The French and Belgian name for the operation is Bataille des Ardennes, Battle of the Ardennes. The battle was militarily defined by the Allies as the Ardennes counteroffensive, which included the German drive and the American effort to contain and later defeat it. The phrase Battle of the Bulge was coined by contemporary press to describe the way the Allied front line bulged inward on wartime news maps. While the Ardennes counteroffensive is the correct term in Allied military language, the official Ardennes-Alsace campaign reached beyond the Ardennes battle region, and the most popular description in English-speaking countries remains simply Battle of the Bulge. Planning. There is a popular impression that the chief trouble in the Ardennes is the lack of good roads. As anyone on the ground will agree, the Ardennes has a fairly good road system. It is not the lack of roads as much as the lack of almost anything else on which to move that matters. The OKW decided by mid-September, at Hitler's insistence, that the offensive would be mounted in the Ardennes, as was done in 1940. In 1940, German forces had passed through the Ardennes in 3 days before engaging the enemy, but the 1944 plan called for battle in the forest itself. The main forces were to advance westward to the Meuse River, then turn northwest for Antwerp and Brussels. The close terrain of the Ardennes would make rapid movement difficult, though open ground beyond the Meuse offered the prospect of a successful dash to the coast. 4 armies were selected for the operation. Adolf Hitler personally selected for the counter-offensive on the northern shoulder of the Western Front, the best troops available and officers he trusted. The lead role in the attack was given to the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. It included the most experienced formation of the Waffen-SS, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. It also contained the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. They were given priority for supply and equipment and assigned the shortest route to the primary objective of the offensive, Antwerp, starting from the northernmost point on the intended battlefront, nearest the important road network hub of Monschau. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel was assigned to the middle sector with the objective of capturing Brussels. The 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger was assigned to the southernmost sector, near the Luxembourgish city of Echternach, with the task of protecting the flank. This army was made up of only 4 infantry divisions, with no large-scale armoured formations to use as a spearhead unit. As a result, they made little progress throughout the battle. In an indirect secondary role, the 15th Army, under General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, recently brought back up to strength and re-equipped after heavy fighting during Operation Market Garden, was located just north of the Ardennes battlefield and tasked with holding US forces in place, with the possibility of launching its own attack given favourable conditions. For the offensive to be successful, 4 criteria were deemed critical. The attack had to be a complete surprise. The weather conditions had to be poor to neutralise Allied air superiority and the damage it could inflict on the German offensive and its supply lines. The progress had to be rapid. The Meuse River, halfway to Antwerp, had to be reached by day 4, and Allied fuel supplies would have to be captured intact along the way, because the combined Wehrmacht forces were short on fuel. The General Staff estimated they only had enough fuel to cover 1/3 to 1/2 of the ground to Antwerp in heavy combat conditions. The plan originally called for just under 45 divisions, including a dozen Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, forming the armoured spearhead, and various infantry units, to form a defensive line as the battle unfolded. By this time, the German army suffered from an acute manpower shortage, and the force had been reduced to around 30 divisions. Although it retained most of its armour, there were not enough infantry units because of the defensive needs in the east. These 30 newly rebuilt divisions used some of the last reserves of the German army. Among them were Volksgrenadier, People's Grenadier, units formed from a mix of battle-hardened veterans and recruits formerly regarded as too young, too old, or too frail to fight. Training time, equipment, and supplies were inadequate during the preparations. German fuel supplies were precarious. Those materials and supplies that could not be directly transported by rail had to be horse-drawn to conserve fuel, and the mechanized and panzer divisions would depend heavily on captured fuel. As a result, the start of the offensive was delayed from 27 November until 16th December. Before the offensive, the Allies were virtually blind to German troop movement. During the liberation of France, the extensive network of the French resistance had provided valuable intelligence about German dispositions. Once they reached the German border, this source dried up. In France, orders had been relayed within the German army using radio messages enciphered by the Enigma machine, and these could be picked up and decrypted by Allied codebreakers headquartered at Bletchley Park to give the intelligence known as Ultra. In Germany, such orders were typically transmitted using telephone and teleprinter, and a special radio silence order was imposed on all matters concerning the upcoming offensive. The major crackdown in the Wehrmacht after the 20th July plot to assassinate Hitler resulted in much tighter security and fewer leaks. The foggy autumn weather also prevented Allied reconnaissance aircraft from correctly assessing the ground situation. German units assembling in the area were even issued charcoal instead of wood for cooking fires to cut down on smoke and reduce chances of Allied observers deducing a troop buildup was underway. For these reasons, Allied High Command considered the Ardennes a quiet sector, relying on assessments from their intelligence services that the Germans were unable to launch any major offensive operations this late in the war. What little intelligence they had led the Allies to believe precisely what the Germans wanted them to believe. that preparations were being carried out only for defensive, not offensive, operations. The Allies relied too much on ultra, not human reconnaissance. In fact, because of the Germans' efforts, the Allies were led to believe that a new defensive army was being formed around Düsseldorf in the northern Rhineland, possibly to defend against British attack. This was done by increasing the number of Flak, Flugabwehrkanonen, i.e. anti-aircraft cannons, in the area, and the artificial multiplication of radio transmissions in the area. All of this meant that the attack, when it came, completely surprised the Allied forces. Remarkably, the US 1st Army Intelligence Chief, US 3rd Army Intelligence Chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, Intelligence Officer Brigadier General Kenneth Strong all correctly predicted the German offensive capability and intention to strike the US 8th Corps area. These predictions were largely dismissed by the US 12th Army Group. Strong had informed Bedell Smith in December of his suspicions. Bedell Smith sent Strong to warn Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, the commander of the 12th Army Group, of the danger. Bradley's response was succinct: "Let them come." Historian Patrick K. O'Donnell writes that on 8 December 1944, US Rangers at great cost took Hill 400 during the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. The next day, GIs who relieved the Rangers reported a considerable movement of German troops inside the Ardennes in the enemy's rear, but that no one in the chain of command connected the dots. British forces further north were slightly better prepared. Having received decoded signals from Bletchley Park containing Luftwaffe instructions not to destroy certain bridges on the Meuse, Montgomery opted to put on hold a planned northward move from XXX Corps and instead held in reserve. This would prove significant in the subsequent battle. Despite this, however, they too were doubtful of the possibility of a major offensive. Because the Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, considerations of economy of force led it to be used as a training ground for new units and a rest area for units that had seen hard fighting. The US units deployed in the Ardennes thus were a mixture of inexperienced troops, such as the 99th and 106th Golden Lions divisions, and battle-hardened troops sent to that sector to recuperate, the 28th Infantry Division. Two major special operations were planned for the offensive. By October, it was decided that Otto Skorzeny, the German SS commando who had rescued the former Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, was to lead a task force of English-speaking German soldiers in Operation Greif. These soldiers were to be dressed in American and British uniforms and wear dog tags taken from corpses and prisoners of war. Their job was to go behind American lines and change signposts, misdirect traffic, generally cause disruption and seize bridges across the Meuse River. By late November, another ambitious special operation was added. Colonel Friedrich August von der Heydte was to lead a Fallschirmjäger Kampfgruppe, paratrooper combat group, in Operation Stösser, a nighttime paratroop drop behind the Allied lines aimed at capturing a vital road junction near Malmedy. German intelligence had set 20th December as the expected date for the start of the upcoming Soviet offensive, aimed at crushing what was left of German resistance on the Eastern Front and thereby opening the way to Berlin. It was hoped that Soviet leader Stalin would delay the start of the operation once the German assault in the Ardennes had begun and wait for the outcome before continuing. After the 20th of July 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler and the close advance of the Red Army which would seize the site on 27th of January 1945, Hitler and his staff had been forced to abandon the Wolfschanze headquarters in East Prussia, in which they had coordinated much of the fighting on the Eastern Front. After a brief visit to Berlin, Hitler travelled on his Führer-Sonderzug, special train of the Führer, to Gießen on 11th of December, taking up residence in the Adlerhorst, Erie command complex, co-located with OB West's base at Kransberg Castle. Believing in omens and the successes of his early war campaigns that had been planned at Kransberg, Hitler had chosen the site from which he had overseen the successful 1940 campaign against France and the Low Countries. Von Rundstedt set up his operational headquarters near Limburg, close enough for the generals and Panzer Corps commanders who were to lead the attack to visit Adlerhorst on 11 December, travelling there in an SS-operated bus convoy. With the castle acting as overflow accommodation, the main party was settled into the Adlerhorst's House 2 command bunker, including General Alfred Jodl, General Wilhelm Keitel, General Blumentritt, von Manteuffel and Dietrich. In a personal conversation on 13 December between Walter Model and Friedrich von der Heydte, who was put in charge of Operation Stösser, Von der Heide gave Operation Stösser less than a 10% chance of succeeding. Model told him it was necessary to make the attempt. It must be done because this offensive is the last chance to conclude the war favorably. Shortly before the start of the offensive, Dietrich and his chief of staff altered the plan. Instead of crossing the Meuse to the west of Liège, 6th Panzer Army would cross on both sides of the city. If the offensive failed to reach Antwerp, Liège could be captured as a small solution. Rundstedt and Model tacitly approved, but Jodl and Hitler were not informed. During post-war questioning, Dietrich's story shifted. First, he claimed that he issued orders to cross between Liège and Huy. When told that the Americans had captured a map showing pincer movements around Liège, Dietrich said it could have been a 15th Army map. When Dietrich was shown the map, he said that the original plan was to cross on either or both sides of Liège depending on the circumstances. When the northern half of his army's attack bogged down, he changed his order to cross between Liège and Huy, both exclusive. He denied any intention of capturing Liège. It would have been cut off and bypassed. Initial German assault. On 16th of December 1944 at 05:30, the Germans began the assault with a massive 90-minute artillery barrage, using 1,600 artillery pieces across a 130-kilometer, 80 miles front, on the Allied troops facing the 6th Panzer Army. The Americans' initial impression was that this was the anticipated, localized counterattack resulting from the Allies' recent attack in the Wallerscheid sector to the north, where the 2nd Division had knocked a sizable dent in the Siegfried Line. Heavy snowstorms engulfed parts of the Ardennes area. While having the effect of keeping the Allied aircraft grounded, the weather also proved troublesome for the Germans because poor road conditions hampered their advance. Poor traffic control led to massive traffic jams and fuel shortages in forward units. Nearly 10 hours into the assault, one of the German V-2 rockets destroyed the Cine Rex cinema in Antwerp, killing 567 people, the highest death toll from a single rocket attack during the war. In the center, von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army attacked towards Bastogne and St. Vith, both road junctions of great strategic importance. In the south, Brandenberger's 7th Army pushed towards Luxembourg in its efforts to secure the flank from Allied attacks. By 17th December 1944, German forces under Colonel Joachim Peiper had seized a US fuel depot in Bullingen, Belgium, containing about 50,000 gallons of gasoline, a major war prize. Units involved in initial assault. Forces deployed north to south northern sector Monschau, to Kriewinkel central sector Roth, to Gemund, southern sector Hochscheid, to Montpach attack on the northern shoulder. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge is described as the decisive component of the Battle of the Bulge. At Elsenborn Ridge, untested troops of the 99th Infantry Division and the battle-hardened but weary troops of the 2nd Infantry Division repelled an advance by some of the best-equipped Volksgrenadier and armoured units of the German army, forcing them to divert their offensive spearhead onto less favourable routes further south, which considerably slowed their advance. Best German divisions assigned. The attack on Monschau, Hofen, Krinkelt-Rocherath, and then Elsenborn Ridge was led by the units personally selected by Adolf Hitler. The 6th Panzer Army was given priority for supply and equipment and was assigned the shortest route to the ultimate objective of the offensive, Antwerp. The 6th Panzer Army included the elite of the Waffen-SS, including 4 panzer divisions and 5 infantry divisions in 3 corps. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper led Kampfgruppe Peiper, consisting of 4,800 men and 600 vehicles, which was charged with leading the main effort. Its newest and most powerful tank, the Tiger II heavy tank, consumed 2 US gallons of fuel per mile, 470 liters per 100 kilometers, and the Germans only had enough fuel for an estimated 90 to 100 miles, 140 to 160 kilometers of travel, not nearly enough to reach Antwerp. German forces held up. The attacks by the 6th Panzer Army's Volksgrenadier units in the north fared badly because of unexpectedly fierce resistance by the US 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, which played a decisive role in blunting the German advance. At Hofen, a town at the northern edge of the 6th Panzer Army's offensive that connected to the crucial Monschau-Open-Liège road network, 3rd Battalion, 395th Infantry Regiment of the 99th, reinforced by Company A, 612th Tank Destroyer Battalion, repeatedly defeated armoured and infantry attacks by the 326th Volksgrenadier Division. Although units at this sector were at times virtually surrounded, it did not yield ground. On at least 6 occasions, the 3rd Battalion of the 395th called in artillery on or close to their own positions. Casualties for the Germans in this sector were heavy and disproportionate. By 18th December, German dead at Hofen numbered 554, an additional 53 were captured, plus an unknown number wounded, while the Americans only suffered 5 killed and 7 wounded. Kampfgruppe Peiper, at the head of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, had been designated to take the Losheim-Losheimer Graben Road, a key route through the Losheim Gap, but it was closed by 2 collapsed overpasses that German engineers failed to repair during the first day. Peiper's forces were rerouted through Lanzerath. To preserve the quantity of armor available, the infantry of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, had been ordered to clear the village first. In another example of bitter American resistance in the north, at Lanzerath Ridge, a single 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division, along with 4 forward air controllers, held up the battalion of about 500 German paratroopers until sunset, about 16 SHAEF, causing 92 casualties among the Germans. This created a bottleneck in the German advance. Kampfgruppe Peiper did not begin its advance until nearly 16 Baus, more than 16 hours behind schedule, and didn't reach Bockholtz Station until the early morning of 17th December. Their intention was to control the twin villages of Rocherath-Krinkelt, which would clear a path to the high ground of Elsenborn Ridge. Occupation of this dominating terrain would allow control of the roads to the south and west and ensure supply to Kampfgruppe Peiper's armoured task force. Malmedy massacres. At 4:30 a.m. on 17th December 1944, the 1st SS Panzer Division was approximately 16 hours behind schedule when the convoys departed the village of Lanzerath en route west to the town of Honsfeld. After capturing Honsfeld, Peiper detoured from his assigned route to seize a small fuel depot in Bullingen, where the Waffen-SS infantry summarily executed dozens of US POWs. Afterwards, Peiper advanced to the west towards the River Meuse and captured Lineuville, bypassing the towns of Mödesheide, Schoppen, Ondenval, and Thirimont. The terrain and poor quality of the roads made the advance of Kampfgruppe Peiper difficult. At the exit to the village of Thirimont, the armoured spearhead was unable to travel the road directly to Lineuville, and Peiper deviated from the planned route, and rather than turn to the left, the armoured spearhead turned to the right and advanced towards the crossroads of Bastogne, which is equidistant from the city of Malmedy and Lineuville and Wimes. At 12:30 p.m. on 17th December, Kampfgruppe Peiper was near the hamlet of Bastogne, on the height halfway between the town of Malmedy and Lineuville, when they encountered elements of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, US 7th Armored Division. After a brief battle, the lightly armed Americans surrendered. They were disarmed and, with some other Americans captured earlier, approximately 150 men, sent to stand in a field near the crossroads under light guard. About 15 minutes after Peiper's advance guard passed through, the main body under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke arrived. The SS troopers suddenly opened fire on the prisoners. As soon as the firing began, the prisoners panicked. Most were shot where they stood, though some managed to flee. Accounts of the killing vary, but at least 84 of the POWs were murdered. Others survived, and news of the killings of prisoners of war spread through Allied lines. Following the end of the war, soldiers and officers of Kampfgruppe Peiper, including Peiper and SS General Dietrich, were tried for the incident at the Malmedy massacre trial. Kampfgruppe Peiper deflected southeast. Driving to the southeast of Elsenborn, Kampfgruppe Peiper entered Honsfeld, where they encountered one of the 99th Division's rest centers clogged with confused American troops. They quickly captured portions of the 3rd Battalion of the 394th Infantry Regiment. They destroyed a number of American armored units and vehicles and took several dozen prisoners who were subsequently murdered. Peiper also captured 50,000 US gallons, 190,000 L, 42,000 imp gal of fuel for his vehicles. Peiper advanced northwest towards Bullingen, keeping to the plan to move west, unaware that if he had turned north, he had an opportunity to flank and trap the entire 2nd and 99th Divisions. Instead, intent on driving west, Peiper turned south to detour around Hüningen, choosing a route designated Rollbahn D, as he had been given latitude to choose the best route west. To the north, the 277th Volksgrenadier Division attempted to break through the defending line of the US 99th and the 2nd Infantry Divisions, but fared poorly. The 12th SS Panzer Division, reinforced by additional infantry, Panzergrenadier and Volksgrenadier units, took the key road junction at Losheimer Graben, just north of Lanzerath, and attacked the twin villages of Rocherath-Krinkelt on 17th December. At Rocherath, attacks by the 12th SS were initially met with success. By midday, the remnants of the 99th at Rocherath were at risk of being overrun. However, reinforcements from the veteran units of the 2nd Infantry Division arrived and put up a strong resistance that repulsed multiple attacks by the 12th SS. At nightfall, however, the defenders, critically low on ammunition, were routed by an armoured night attack and fell back to Krinkelt. The German armoured spearhead then held its position outside of Krinkelt out of fear that it might run into a superior force. Wereth 11. Another, smaller massacre was committed in Wereth, Belgium, approximately 6.5 miles, 10.5 kilometers, northeast of St. Vith, on 17th of December 1944. 11 black American soldiers were tortured after surrendering and then shot by men of the 1st SS Panzer Division belonging to Schnellgruppe Knittel. Some of the injuries sustained before death included bayonet wounds to the head, broken legs, and their fingers cut off. The perpetrators were never punished for this crime. Germans advanced west. By the evening, the spearhead had pushed north to engage the US 99th Infantry Division, and Kampfgruppe Peiper arrived in front of Stavelot. Peiper's forces were already behind his timetable because of the stiff American resistance, and because when the Americans fell back, their engineers blew up bridges and emptied fuel dumps. Peiper's unit was delayed, and his vehicles denied critically needed fuel. They took 36 hours to advance from the Eifel region to Stavelot, while the same advance required 9 hours in 1940. Kampfgruppe Peiper attacked Stavelot on 18th December, but was unable to capture the town before the Americans evacuated a large fuel depot. 3 tanks attempted to take the bridge, but the lead vehicle was disabled by a mine. Following this, 60 grenadiers advanced forward, but were stopped by concentrated American defensive fire. After a fierce tank battle the next day, the Germans finally entered the town when US engineers failed to blow the bridge. Capitalizing on his success and not wanting to lose more time, Peiper rushed an advance group toward the vital bridge at Trois Ponts, leaving the bulk of his strength in Stavelot. When they reached it at 11:30 on 18th December, retreating US engineers blew it up. Peiper detoured north towards the villages of La Glaise and Chenogne. At Chenogne, the advance guard was attacked by American fighter bombers, destroying 2 tanks and 5 half-tracks, blocking the narrow road. The group began moving again at dusk at 16 Pry and was able to return to its original route at around 18 Pry. Of the 2 bridges remaining between Kampfgruppe Peiper and the Meuse, the bridge over the Lienne was blown by the Americans as the Germans approached. Peiper turned north and halted his forces in the woods between La Glaise and Stoumont. He learned that Stoumont was strongly held and that the Americans were bringing up strong reinforcements from Spa. To Peiper's south, the advance of Kampfgruppe Hansen had stalled. SS Oberführer Mohnke ordered Schnellgruppe Knittel, which had been designated to follow Hansen, to instead move forward to support Peiper. SS Sturmbannführer Knittel crossed the bridge at Stavelot, around 19 hours against American forces trying to retake the town. Knittel pressed forward towards La Glaise, and shortly afterward, the Americans recaptured Stavelot. Peiper and Knittel both faced the prospect of being cut off. In early morning of the 18th at Elsenborn, the 12th SS renewed their advance into Krinkelt, which was now held mostly by the veteran 38th Infantry Regiment, along with remnants of the 99th. The outnumbered 38th again put up a strong defense that dissolved into fierce close quarters, house-to-house fighting as German infantry and tanks stormed the village. Despite a tenacious resistance, the defenders were ordered to break contact, abandon the twin villages, and re-establish positions on the strategic boomerang-shaped Elsenborn Ridge. German advance halted. At dawn on 19th December, Peiper surprised the American defenders of Stoumont by sending infantry from the 2nd SS Panzergrenadier Regiment in an attack and a company of Fallschirmjäger to infiltrate their lines. He followed this with a panzer attack, gaining the eastern edge of the town. An American tank battalion arrived, but after a 2-hour tank battle, Peiper finally captured Stoumont at 10:30. Knittel joined up with Peiper and reported the Americans had recaptured Stavelot to their east. Peiper ordered Knittel to retake Stavelot, Assessing his own situation, he determined that his Kampfgruppe did not have sufficient fuel to cross the bridge west of Stoumont and continue his advance. He maintained his lines west of Stoumont for a while, until the evening of 19th of December, when he withdrew them to the village edge. On the same evening, the US 82nd Airborne Division, under Major General James Gavin, arrived and deployed at La Glaise and along Peiper's planned route of advance. German efforts to reinforce Peiper were unsuccessful. Kampfgruppe Hansen was still struggling against bad road conditions and stiff American resistance on the southern route. Schnellgruppe Knittel was forced to disengage from the heights around Stavelot. Kampfgruppe Sandig, which had been ordered to take Stavelot, launched another attack without success. 6th Panzer Army Commander Sepp Dietrich ordered Hermann Priess, commanding officer of the ISS Panzer Corps, to increase its efforts to back Peiper's battle group, but Priess was unable to break through. Small units of the US 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division attacked the dispersed units of Kampfgruppe Peiper on the morning of 21st December. They failed and were forced to withdraw, and a number were captured, including Battalion Commander Major Hal D. McCown. Peiper learned that his reinforcements had been directed to gather in La Glaise to his east, and he withdrew, leaving wounded Americans and Germans in the Froidcourt Castle. As he withdrew from Chenogne, American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division engaged the Germans in fierce house-to-house fighting. The Americans shelled Kampfgruppe Peiper on 22nd December, and although the Germans had run out of food and had virtually no fuel, they continued to fight. A Luftwaffe resupply mission went badly when SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke insisted the grid coordinates supplied by Peiper were wrong, parachuting supplies into American hands in Stoumont. In La Glaise, Peiper set up defenses waiting for German relief. When the relief force was unable to penetrate the Allied lines, he decided to break through the Allied lines and return to the German lines on 23rd December. The men of the Kampfgruppe were forced to abandon their vehicles and heavy equipment, although most of the 800 remaining troops were able to escape, out of an initial force of 4,800. Further north at Elsenborn, the Americans continued to hold the line against the brunt of the 6th Panzer Army. South of Elsenborn Ridge, at the village of Dom Butgenbach, reinforcements from the 26th Infantry Regiment of the veteran 1st Infantry Division, supported by divisional artillery, put up a determined defense that halted repeated attacks by 12th SS on the 20th, 21st and 22nd, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers. After the battle, American Graves registration counted 782 German dead in the area. 47 German tanks were destroyed in this sector. While some tanks managed to break through the lines during these attacks, the SS Panzer Grenadiers failed to even reach the lines due to heavy artillery fire. Alongside these attacks, the 6th Panzer Army committed the reserve veteran 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division against Elsenborn Ridge itself. These Panzer Grenadiers from the regular army likewise fared poorly against American artillery. They suffered heavy casualties as the Americans, entrenched in strong positions on the ridge, laid down heavy fire when they emerged from the tree line and advanced up the slopes. 6th Panzer Army north of Peiper was effectively halted at Dom Butgenbach and Elsenborn Ridge. After one final desperate attack by the 246th Volksgrenadier Division on 26 February against the ridge failed, they made no further attempts to attack these positions. Outcome: the stiff American defense prevented the Germans from reaching the vast array of supplies near the Belgian cities of Liège and Spa, and the road network west of the Elsenborn Ridge leading to the Meuse River. After more than 10 days of intense battle, they pushed the Americans out of the villages, but were unable to dislodge them from the ridge, where elements of the V Corps of the 1st US Army prevented the German forces from reaching the road network to their west. With the exception Kampfgruppe Peiper's frustrated advance, what was envisioned as the main thrust of Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front was halted at Elsenborn Ridge. Historian John S. D. Eisenhower wrote, "The action of the 2nd and 99th Divisions on the northern shoulder could be considered the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. American losses were substantial. The 2nd Infantry Division lost over 1,000 men, killed or unaccounted for. The 99th Infantry Division endured even greater losses, particularly among units caught in the path of Kampfgruppe Peiper, with casualties exceeding 3,000. Including supporting units, total American killed or missing in defense of the northern shoulder around Elsenborn rose to slightly more than 5,000. Operation Stösser. Operation Stösser was a paratroop drop into the American rear in the High Fens, French, Hautes Fagnes, German, Hohes-Venn, Dutch, Hoogevenen, area. The objective was the Barak-Michel crossroads. It was led by Oberst Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte, considered by Germans to be a hero of the Battle of Crete. It was the German paratroopers' only nighttime drop during World War II. Heydte was given only 8 days to prepare prior to the assault. He was not allowed to use his own regiment because their movement might alert the Allies to the impending counterattack. Instead, he was provided with a Kampfgruppe of 800 men. The 2nd Parachute Corps was tasked with contributing 100 men from each of its regiments. In loyalty to their commander, 150 men from Heydte's own unit, the 6th Parachute Regiment, went against orders and joined him. They had little time to establish any unit cohesion or train together. The parachute drop was a complete failure. Heydte ended up with a total of around 300 troops. Too small and too weak to counter the Allies, they abandoned plans to take the crossroads and instead converted the mission to reconnaissance. With only enough ammunition for a single fight, they withdrew towards Germany and attacked the rear of the American lines. Only about 100 of his weary men finally reached the German rear. Attack in the center. The Germans fared better in the center, the 32 kilometers, 20 miles, Schnee-Eifel sector, as the 5th Panzer Army attacked positions held by the US 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions. The Germans lacked the overwhelming strength that had been deployed in the north, but still possessed a marked numerical and material superiority over the very thinly spread veteran 28th and inexperienced 106th Divisions. They succeeded in surrounding 2 largely intact regiments, 422nd and 423rd, of the 106th Division in a pincer movement and forced their surrender, a tribute to the way Manterfell's new tactics had been applied. The official US Army history states, at least 7,000 men were lost here, and the figure probably is closer to 8,000 or 9,000. The amount lost in arms and equipment, of course, was very substantial. The Schnee-Eifel battle, therefore, represents the most serious reverse suffered by American arms during the operations of 1944-45 in the European theatre. Battle for St. Vith. In the center, the town of St. Vith, a vital road junction, presented the main challenge for both von Manteuffel's and Dietrich's forces. The defenders, led by the 7th Armored Division, included the remaining regiment of the 106th US Infantry Division, with elements of the 9th Armored Division and 28th US Infantry Division. These units, which operated under the command of Generals Robert W. Hasbrouck, 7th Armored, and Alan W. Jones, 106th Infantry, successfully resisted the German attacks, significantly slowing the German advance. At Montgomery's orders, St. Vith was evacuated on 21st December. US troops fell back to entrenched positions in the area, presenting an imposing obstacle to a successful German advance. By 23rd December, as the Germans shattered their flanks, the defenders' position became untenable, and US troops were ordered to retreat west of the Salm River. Since the German plan called for the capture of St. Vith by 1815 on 17th December, the prolonged action in and around it dealt a major setback to their timetable. Meuse River bridges. To protect the river crossings on the Meuse at Givet, Dinant and Namur, Montgomery ordered those few units available to hold the bridges on 19th December. This led to a hastily assembled force, including rear echelon troops, military police, and Army Air Force personnel. The British 29th Armoured Brigade of British 11th Armoured Division, which had turned in its tanks for re-equipping, was told to take back their tanks and head to the area. British the 30th Corps was significantly reinforced for this effort. Units of the Corps which fought in the Ardennes were the 51st Highland and 53rd Welsh Infantry Divisions, the British 6th Airborne Division, the 29th and 33rd Armoured Brigades, and the 34th Tank Brigade. Unlike the German forces on the northern and southern shoulders, who were experiencing great difficulties, the German advance in the centre gained considerable ground. The 5th Panzer Army was spearheaded by the 2nd Panzer Division, while the Panzer Lehr Division, Elite Armoured Demonstration Division, came up from the south, leaving Bastogne to other units. The Orthe River was passed at Ortheville on 21st December. Lack of fuel held up the advance for one day, but on 23rd December, the offensive was resumed towards the 2 small towns of Hagemont and Marchand-Famenne. Hagemont was captured the same day, but Marchand-Famenne was strongly defended by the American 84th Division. General von Luttwitz, commander of the XX-6 7th Panzer Corps, ordered the division to turn westwards towards Dinant and the Meuse, leaving only a blocking force at Marche-en-Famenne. Although advancing only in a narrow corridor, 2nd Panzer Division was still making rapid headway, leading to jubilation in Berlin. Headquarters now freed up the 9th Panzer Division for 5th Panzer Army, which was deployed at Marche. On 22-23 December, German forces reached the woods of Foy-Notre-Dame, only a few kilometers ahead of Dinant. The narrow corridor caused considerable difficulties, as constant flanking attacks threatened the division. On 24 December, German forces made their furthest penetration west. The Panzer Lehr Division took the town of Celles, while a bit farther north, parts of 2nd Panzer Division were in sight of the Meuse near Dinant at Foy-Notre-Dame. A hastily assembled British blocking force on the east side of the river prevented the German battle group Böhm from approaching the Dinant Bridge. The 29th Armoured Brigade ambushed the Germans, knocking out 3 Panthers and a number of vehicles in and around Foy-Notre-Dame. By late Christmas Eve, the advance in this sector was stopped, as Allied forces threatened the narrow corridor held by the 2nd Panzer Division. Operation Greif and Operation Währung. For Operation Greif, Griffin, Otto Skorzeny successfully infiltrated a small part of his battalion of English-speaking Germans disguised in American uniforms behind the Allied lines. Although they failed to take the vital bridges over the Meuse, their presence caused confusion out of all proportion to their military activities, and rumours spread quickly. Even General George Patton was alarmed and, on 17th December, described the situation to General Dwight Eisenhower as "Krauts, speaking perfect English, raising hell, cutting wires, turning road signs around, spooking whole divisions, and shoving a Bulge into our defences." Checkpoints were set up all over the Allied rear, greatly slowing the movement of soldiers and equipment. American MPs at these checkpoints grilled troops on things that every American was expected to know, like the identity of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, baseball scores, or the capital of a particular US state, though many could not remember or did not know. General Omar Bradley was briefly detained when he correctly identified Springfield as the capital of Illinois, because the American MP who questioned him mistakenly believed the capital was Chicago. The tightened security nonetheless made things very hard for the German infiltrators, and a number of them were captured. Even during interrogation, they continued their goal of spreading disinformation. When asked about their mission, some of them claimed they had been told to go to Paris to either kill or capture General Dwight Eisenhower. Security around the general was greatly increased, and Eisenhower was confined to his headquarters. Because Skorzeny's men were captured in American uniforms, they were executed as spies. This was a standard punishment option for most armies of the time, as many belligerents considered it necessary to protect their territory and forces against the grave dangers of enemy spying. Skorzeny said that he was told by German legal experts that as long as he did not order his men to fight in combat while wearing American uniforms, such a tactic was a legitimate ruse of war. Skorzeny and his men were fully aware of their likely fate, and most wore their German uniforms underneath their American ones in case of capture. Skorzeny was tried by an American military tribunal in 1947 at the Dachau trials for allegedly violating the laws of war stemming from his leadership of Operation Greif, but was acquitted. He later moved to Spain and South America, attack in the south. Further south on Manteufel's front, the main thrust was delivered by all attacking divisions crossing the River Our, then increasing the pressure on the key road centres of St. Vith and Bastogne. The more experienced US 28th Infantry Division put up a much more dogged defence than the inexperienced soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division. The 112th Infantry Regiment, the most northerly of the 28th Division's regiments, holding a continuous front east of the Our, kept German troops from seizing and using the Our River bridges around Ardennes for 2 days, before withdrawing progressively westwards. The 109th and 110th Regiments of the 28th Division fared worse, as they were spread so thinly that their positions were easily bypassed. Both offered stubborn resistance in the face of superior forces and threw the German schedule off by several days. The 110th situation was by far the worst, as it was responsible for an 18-kilometre, 11 miles front, while its 2nd Battalion was withheld as the divisional reserve. Panzer columns took the outlying villages and widely separated strongpoints in bitter fighting, and advanced to points near Bastogne within 4 days. The struggle for the villages and American strongpoints, plus transport confusion on the German side, slowed the attack sufficiently to allow the 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements from the 9th and 10th Armoured Divisions, to reach Bastogne by truck on the morning of 19th of December. The fierce defense of Bastogne, in which American paratroopers particularly distinguished themselves, made it impossible for the Germans to take the town with its important road junctions. The panzer columns swung past on either side, cutting off Bastogne on 20th December, but failing to secure the vital crossroads. 20 years after the battle, General McAuliffe praised the men of the 10th Armoured Tiger Division, saying, "It's always seemed regrettable to me that Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division didn't get the credit it deserved in the Battle of Bastogne. All of the newspaper and radio talk was about the paratroopers. Actually, the 10th Armoured Division was in there December 18th, a day before we were, and had some very hard fighting before we ever got into it. And I sincerely believe that we would never have been able to get into Bastogne if it had not been for the defensive fighting of the three elements of the 10th Armoured Division who were first into Bastogne and protected the town from invasion by the Germans. In the extreme south, Brandenberger's 3 infantry divisions were checked by divisions of the US 8 Corps after an advance of 6.4 kilometers, 4 miles. That front was then firmly held. Only the 5th Parachute Division of Brandenberger's command was able to thrust forward 19 kilometers, 12 miles, on the inner flank to partially fulfill its assigned role. Eisenhower and his principal commanders realized by 17th December that the fighting in the Ardennes was a major offensive and not a local counterattack, and they ordered vast reinforcements to the area. Within a week, 250,000 troops had been sent. General Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division arrived on the scene first and ordered the 101st to hold Bastogne, while the 82nd would take the more difficult task of facing the SS Panzer divisions. It was also thrown into the battle north of the Bulge, near Elsenborn Ridge. Siege of Bastogne. Senior Allied commanders met in a bunker in Verdun on 19th December. By this time, the town of Bastogne and its network of 11 hard-topped roads, leading through the widely forested mountainous terrain with deep river valleys and boggy mud of the Ardennes region, was under severe threat. Bastogne had previously been the site of the 8th Corps headquarters. 2 separate westbound German columns that were to have bypassed the town to the south and north. The 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division of Exelfeven Panzer Corps, as well as the Corps' infantry, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, coming due west, had been engaged and much slowed and frustrated in outlying battles at defensive positions up to 16 kilometers, 10 miles, from the town proper. But these defensive positions were gradually being forced back onto and into the hasty defenses built within the municipality. Moreover, the sole corridor that was open to the southeast was threatened, and it had been sporadically closed as the front shifted, and there was expectation that it would be completely closed sooner than later, given the strong likelihood that the town would soon be surrounded. General Eisenhower, realizing that the Allies could destroy German forces much more easily when they were out in the open and on the offensive than if they were on the defensive, told his generals, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table." Patton, realizing what Eisenhower implied, responded, "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." Eisenhower, after saying he was not that optimistic, asked Patton how long it would take to turn his Third Army, located in northeastern France, north to counterattack. To the disbelief of the other generals present, Patton replied that he could attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours. Unknown to the other officers present, before he left, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for a northward turn in at least core strength. By the time Eisenhower asked him how long it would take, the movement was already underway. On 20th December, Eisenhower removed the 1st and 9th US Armies from General Bradley's 12th Army Group and placed them under Montgomery's 21st Army Group. By 21st December, the Germans had surrounded Bastogne, which was defended by the 101st Airborne Division, the All-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion, and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. Conditions inside the perimeter were tough. Most of the medical supplies and medical personnel had been captured. Food was scarce, and by 20th December, artillery ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. The weather cleared the next day, and supplies, primarily ammunition, were dropped over 4 of the next 5 days. Despite determined German attacks, the perimeter held. The German commander Luttwitz requested Bastogne's surrender. When Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, was told of the German demand to surrender, in frustration he responded, "Nuts!" After turning to other pressing issues, his staff reminded him that they should reply to the German demand. One officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, noted that McAuliffe's initial reply would be tough to beat. Thus McAuliffe wrote on the paper, which was typed up and delivered to the Germans, the line he made famous and a morale booster to his troops: "Nuts." That reply had to be explained, both to the Germans and to non-American allies. Both 2nd Panzer and Panzerlehr Division moved forward from Bastogne after 21st December, leaving only Panzerlehr Division's 901st Regiment to assist the 26th Volksgrenadier Division in attempting to capture the crossroads. The 26th VG received one Panzergrenadier Regiment from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division on Christmas Eve for its main assault the next day. Because it lacked sufficient troops and those of the 26th VG Division were near exhaustion, the XL Vth Panzer Corps concentrated its assault on several individual locations on the west side of the perimeter in sequence rather than launching one simultaneous attack on all sides. The assault, despite initial success by its tanks in penetrating the American line, was defeated and all the tanks destroyed. On the following day of 26 December, the spearhead of General Patton's 4th Armored Division, supplemented by the 26th Yankee Infantry Division, broke through and opened a corridor to Bastogne. The siege of Bastogne had lasted barely a week. Allied counterstrikes. On 23 December, the weather conditions started improving, allowing the Allied air forces to attack. They launched devastating bombing raids on the German supply points in their rear, and P-47 Thunderbolts started attacking the German troops on the roads. Allied air forces also helped the defenders of Bastogne, dropping much-needed supplies, medicine, food, blankets, and ammunition. A team of volunteer surgeons flew in by military glider and began operating in a tool room. By 24 December, the German advance was effectively stalled short of the Meuse. Units of the British the 30th Corps were holding the bridges at Dinant, Givet, and Namur, and US units were about to take over. The Germans had outrun their supply lines, and shortages of fuel and ammunition were becoming critical. Up to this point, the German losses had been light, notably in armor, with the exception of Peiper's losses. On the evening of 24 December, Manteuffel recommended to Hitler's military adjutant a halt to all offensive operations and a withdrawal back to the West Wall. Hitler rejected this. Disagreement and confusion at the Allied command prevented a strong response, throwing away the opportunity for a decisive action. In the center, on Christmas Eve, the 2nd Armored Division attempted to attack and cut off the spearheads of the 2nd Panzer Division at the Meuse, while the units from the 4th Cavalry Group kept the 9th Panzer Division at Marche busy. As a result, parts of the 2nd Panzer Division were cut off. The Panzerlehr Division tried to relieve them, but was only partially successful as the perimeter held. For the next 2 days, the perimeter was strengthened. On 26 and 27 December, the trapped units of 2nd Panzer Division made 2 breakout attempts, again only with partial success, as major quantities of equipment fell into Allied hands. Further Allied pressure out of Marche finally led the German command to the conclusion that no further offensive action towards the Meuse was possible. In the south, Patton's Third Army was battling to relieve Bastogne. At 1650 on 26 December, the lead element, Company D, 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, reached Bastogne, ending the siege. German supporting efforts across the Western Front. On 1 January, in an attempt to keep the offensive going, the Germans launched 2 new operations. At 09:15, the Luftwaffe launched Unternehmen Bodenplatte, Operation Baseplate, a major campaign against Allied airfields in the Low Countries. Hundreds of planes attacked Allied airfields, destroying or severely damaging some 465 aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost 277 planes, 62 to Allied fighters and 172, mostly because of an unexpectedly high number of Allied flak guns, set up to protect against German V-1 flying bomb Choch missile attacks and using proximity-fused shells, but also by friendly fire from the German flak guns that were uninformed of the pending large-scale German air operation. The Germans suffered heavy losses at an airfield named Y-29, losing 40 of their own planes while damaging only 4 American planes. While the Allies recovered from their losses within days, the operation left the Luftwaffe ineffective for the remainder of the war. On the same day, German Army Group G, Heeresgruppe G, and Army Group Upper Rhine, Heeresgruppe Oberrhein, launched a major offensive against the thinly stretched 110 kilometers, 70 miles line of the 7th US Army. This offensive, known as Unternehmen Nordwind, Operation Northwind, and separate from the Ardennes Offensive, was the last major German offensive of the war on the Western Front. The weakened 7th Army had, at Eisenhower's orders, sent troops, equipment, and supplies north to reinforce the American armies in the Ardennes, and the offensive left it in dire straits. By 15 January, 7th Army's the 6th Corps was fighting on 3 sides in Alsace, with casualties mounting and running short on replacements, tanks, ammunition, and supplies. 7th Army was forced to withdraw to defensive positions on the south bank of the Meuse River on 21 January. The German offensive drew to a close on 25 January. In the bitter, desperate fighting of Operation Nordwind, 6th Corps, which had borne the brunt of the fighting, suffered a total of 14,716 casualties. The total for 7th Army for January was 11,609. Total casualties included at least 9,000 wounded. 1st, 3rd and 7th Armies suffered a total of 17,000 hospitalized from the cold. Allied counter-offensive. While the German offensive toward the Meuse had ground to a halt by the end of December, they still controlled a dangerous salient in the Allied line. Patton's 3rd Army in the south, centered around Bastogne, would attack north. Montgomery's forces in the north would strike south, and the two forces planned to meet at Houffalize to reduce the Bulge and push east back toward the offensive start line. The temperature during that January was extremely low, which required weapons to be maintained and truck engines run every half hour to prevent their oil from congealing. The offensive went forward regardless. Eisenhower wanted Montgomery to go on the counteroffensive on 1 January, with the aim of meeting up with Patton's advancing 3rd Army and cutting off German troops at the tip of the salient, trapping them in a pocket. Montgomery, refusing to risk underprepared infantry in a snowstorm for a strategically unimportant area, did not launch the attack until 3 January. In addition, a series of renewed German attempts to re-encircle and seize Bastogne using units moved to the southern shoulder of the salient from the north, put Patton in a desperate fight for the initiative, with the German maintaining offensive operations in sectors north and east of Bastogne until 7 January, and resulting in heavier fighting than during the 21–26 December siege of Bastogne itself. In addition, Patton's 3rd Army would have to clear out the Harlange pocket east of Bastogne on the Belgian-Luxembourg border. One of these fierce actions around Bastogne occurred on 2 January. The Tiger IIs of German Heavy Tank Battalion 506 supported an attack by the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division against US positions of the 6th Armored Division near Warden and knocked out 15 Sherman tanks. At the start of the offensive, the 1st and 3rd US armies were separated by about 40 kilometers, 25 miles. American progress in the south was also restricted to about a kilometer or a little over half a mile per day. On 7–8 January 1945, Hitler agreed to gradually withdraw forces from the tip of the Ardennes salient to east of Houffalize to avoid being cut off, but the Germans continued to resist in the salient and were only gradually pushed back otherwise. Considerable fighting went on for another 3 weeks, with 3rd Army and 1st Army linking up on 16th January with the capture of Houffalize. 6th Panzer Army left the Ardennes and ceded its sector to the 5th Panzer Army on 22nd January, while St. Vith was recaptured by the Americans on 23rd January, and the last German units participating in the offensive did not return to their start line until February. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons following the Battle of the Bulge, said, "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." Chenogne Massacre. After receiving news of the Malmedy massacre during the counter-offensive at the southern shoulder on New Year's Day 1945, American soldiers of the inexperienced 11th Armored Division executed approximately 60 German prisoners of war near the Belgian village of Chenogne, 8 kilometers from Bastogne. Force comparisons by date, strategy and leadership. Hitler's chosen few. The plan and timing for the Ardennes attack sprang from the mind of Adolf Hitler. He believed a critical fault line existed between the British and American military commands, and that a heavy blow on the Western Front would shatter this alliance. Planning for the Watch on the Rhine offensive emphasized secrecy and the commitment of overwhelming force due to the use of landline communications within Germany. motorized runners carrying orders, and draconian threats from Hitler, the timing and mass of the attack was not detected by ultra-code breakers and achieved complete surprise. After officers of the Heer attempted to assassinate him, Hitler had increasingly trusted only the SS and its armed branch, the Waffen-SS. He entrusted them with carrying out his decisive counterattack, but following the Allied Normandy invasion, the SS armoured units had suffered significant leadership casualties. This included SS Brigade Führer, Brigadier General Kurt Meyer, commander of the 12th SS Panzer, Armour Division, captured by Belgian partisans on 6 September 1944. Thus, Hitler gave responsibility for the key right flank of the assault to the best SS troops and a few Volksgrenadier units under the command of Sepp, Joseph Dietrich, a fanatical political disciple of Hitler and a loyal follower from the early days of the rise of National Socialism in Germany. The leadership composition of the 6th Panzer Army had a distinctly political nature. Despite their loyalty, none of the German field commanders entrusted with planning and executing the offensive believed it was possible to capture Antwerp. Even Dietrich believed the Ardennes was a poor area for armoured warfare, and that the inexperienced and badly equipped Volksgrenadier soldiers would clog the roads the tanks needed for their rapid advance. In fact, their horse-drawn artillery and rocket units became a significant obstacle to the armoured units. Other than making futile objections to Hitler in private, Dietrich generally stayed out of planning the offensive. Model and Manteuffel, technical experts from the Eastern Front, told Hitler that a limited offensive with the goal of surrounding and crushing the American First Army would be the best goal their offensive could hope to achieve. Their ideas shared the same fate as Dietrich's objections. The German staff planning and organization of the attack was well done. Most of the units committed to the offensive reached their jump-off points undetected. They were for the most part well organized and supplied for the attack, although they were counting on capturing American gasoline dumps to fuel their vehicles. As the battle ensued, on the northern shoulder of the offensive, Dietrich stopped the armoured assault on the twin villages after 2 days and changed the axis of their advance southward through the hamlet of Domaine Bütgenbach. The headlong drive on Elsenborn Ridge lacked needed support from German units that had already bypassed the ridge. Dietrich's decision unknowingly played into American hands, as Robertson had already decided to abandon the villages. Allied High Command controversy. One of the fault lines between the British and American high commands was Eisenhower's commitment to a broad front advance. This view was opposed by the British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, as well as Field Marshal Montgomery, who promoted a rapid advance on a narrow front under his command, with the other Allied armies in reserve. Eisenhower based his decision on various military and political realities. The Allied occupation zones in Germany had been agreed upon in February 1944, and a faster Allied advance in the autumn of 1944 would not have altered this. The Soviet Union would have also benefited from a rapid German collapse, and its participation in the war against Japan was greatly desired. There were reservations about whether the Allied logistical system possessed the required flexibility to support the narrow front strategy. The reality of terrain and logistics argued strongly against it, and the consequences if the narrow front advance had failed would have been very severe. Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Guingand, stated in his post-war account that he had opposed Montgomery's narrow front strategy on political and administrative grounds. Montgomery's actions. Montgomery differed from the US command in how to respond to the German attack, and his public statements to that effect caused tension in the American High Command. Major General Freddie de Guingand, Chief of Staff of Montgomery's 21st Army Group, rose to the occasion and personally smoothed over the disagreements on 30th of December. As the Ardennes crisis developed, the US 1st Army, Hodges, and US 9th Army, Simpson, on the northern shoulder of the German penetration, lost communications with adjacent armies, as well as with Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg City to the south of the Bulge. Consequently, at 10:30 a.m. on 20th December, Eisenhower transferred the command of the US 1st and 9th Armies, temporarily from Bradley to Montgomery. Command of the US 1st Army reverted to the US 12th Army Group on 17th of January 1945, and command of the US 9th Army reverted to the US 12th Army Group on 4th of April 1945. Montgomery wrote about the situation he found on 20th December. The 1st Army was fighting desperately. Having given orders to Dempsey and Crerar, who arrived for a conference at 11 a.m., I left at noon for the HQ of the First Army, where I had instructed Simpson to meet me. I found the northern flank of the Bulge was very disorganized. 9th Army had 2 corps and 3 divisions. 1st Army had 3 corps and 15 divisions. Neither army commander had seen Bradley or any senior member of his staff since the battle began, and they had no directive on which to work. The first thing to do was to see the battle on the northern flank as one whole, to ensure the vital areas were held securely, and to create reserves for counterattack. I embarked on these measures. I put British troops under command of the 9th Army to fight alongside American soldiers, and made that army take over some of the 1st Army front. I positioned British troops as reserves behind the 1st and 9th Armies until such time as American reserves could be created. Slowly but surely the situation was held and then finally restored. Similar action was taken on the southern flank of the Bulge by Bradley with the 3rd Army. Due to the news blackout imposed on the 16th, the change of leadership to Montgomery did not become public information until SHAEF announced that the change in command had absolutely nothing to do with failure on the part of the 3 American generals. The announcement resulted in headlines in British newspapers and Stars and Stripes, which for the first time mentioned British contributions to the fighting. Montgomery requested permission from Churchill to give a press conference to explain the situation. Though some of his staff were concerned at how the press conference would affect Montgomery's image, it was cleared by CIGS Alan Brooke, who was possibly the only person from whom Montgomery would accept advice. On the same day as Hitler's withdrawal order of 7th of January, Montgomery held his press conference at Zonhoven. Montgomery started with giving credit to the courage and good fighting quality of the American troops, characterizing a typical American as a very brave fighting man who has that tenacity in battle which makes a great soldier, and went on to talk about the necessity of Allied teamwork, and praised Eisenhower, stating, "Teamwork wins battles, and battle victories win wars. On our team, the captain is General Ike." Then Montgomery described the course of the battle for a half hour. Coming to the end of his speech, he said he had employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. This power was brought into play very gradually. Finally, it was put into battle with a bang. You thus have the picture of British troops fighting on both sides of the Americans who have suffered a hard blow. He stated that he, i.e. the German, was headed off, seen off, and written off. The battle has been the most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. Despite his positive remarks about American soldiers, the overall impression given by Montgomery, at least in the ears of the American military leadership, was that he had taken the lion's share of credit for the success of the campaign and had been responsible for rescuing the besieged Americans. His comments were interpreted as self-promoting, particularly his claim that when the situation began to deteriorate, Eisenhower had placed him in command in the north. Patton and Eisenhower both felt this was a misrepresentation of the relative share of the fighting played by the British and Americans in the Ardennes. For every British soldier, there were 30 to 40 Americans in the fight, and that it belittled the part played by Bradley, Patton, and other American commanders. In the context of Patton's and Montgomery's well-known antipathy, Montgomery's failure to mention the contribution of any American general besides Eisenhower was seen as insulting. Indeed, Bradley and his American commanders were already starting their counterattack by the time Montgomery was given command of 1st and 9th US armies. Focusing exclusively on his own generalship, Montgomery continued to say he thought the counteroffensive had gone very well, but did not explain the reason for his delayed attack on 3rd January. He later attributed this to needing more time for preparation on the northern front. According to Churchill, the attack from the south under Patton was steady but slow and involved heavy losses, and Montgomery was trying to avoid this situation. Morlock states that Monty was preoccupied with being allowed to lead a single thrust offensive to Berlin as the overall commander of Allied ground forces, and that he accordingly treated the Ardennes counteroffensive as a sideshow to be finished with the least possible effort and expenditure of resources. Many American officers had already grown to dislike Montgomery, who was seen by them as an overly cautious commander, arrogant, and all too willing to say uncharitable things about the Americans. However, on 18th of January 1945, Churchill stated to Parliament, "The United States troops have done almost all the fighting." He ended with, "Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." Montgomery subsequently recognized his error and later wrote, "Not only was it probably a mistake to have held this conference at all in the sensitive state of feeling at the time, but what I said was skillfully distorted by the enemy." BBC correspondent Chester Wilmot explained that, "My dispatch to the BBC about it was intercepted by the German wireless, rewritten to give it an anti-American bias, and then broadcast by Arnhem Radio, which was then in Goebbels' hands. Monitored at Bradley's HQ, this broadcast was mistaken for a BBC transmission, and it was this twisted text that started the uproar." Montgomery later said, "Distorted or not, I think now that I should never have held that press conference. So great were the feelings against me on the part of the American generals that whatever I said was bound to be wrong. I should therefore have said nothing." Eisenhower commented in his own memoirs, "I doubt if Montgomery ever came to realize how resentful some American commanders were. They believed he had belittled them, and they were not slow to voice reciprocal scorn and contempt." Bradley and Patton both threatened to resign unless Montgomery's command was changed. Eisenhower, encouraged by his British deputy Arthur Tedder, had decided to sack Montgomery. Intervention by Montgomery's and Eisenhower's chiefs of staff, Guingand and Walter Smith, moved Eisenhower to reconsider and allowed Montgomery to apologize. After the war, Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, was imprisoned awaiting trial for war crimes. During this period, he was interviewed by B.H. Liddell Hart, a British author who has since been accused of putting words in the mouths of German generals and attempting to rewrite the historical record. After conducting several interviews via an interpreter, Liddell Hart, in a subsequent book, attributed to Manteuffel the following statement about Montgomery's contribution to the battle in the Ardennes. The operations of the American First Army had developed into a series of individual holding actions. Montgomery's contribution to restoring the situation was that he turned a series of isolated actions into a coherent battle fought according to a clear and definite plan. It was his refusal to engage in premature and piecemeal counterattacks which enabled the Americans to gather their reserves and frustrate the German attempts to extend their breakthrough. However, American historian Stephen Ambrose, writing in 1997, maintained that putting Monty in command of the northern flank had no effect on the battle. Ambrose wrote that, far from directing the victory, Montgomery had gotten in everyone's way and had botched the counterattack. Bradley blamed Montgomery's stagnating conservatism for his failure to counterattack when ordered to do so by Eisenhower. In contrast, historian Professor John Buckley, writing in 2013, noted how Montgomery must take considerable credit for stabilizing the position due to his efficient and disciplined system of controlling or gripping subordinates. Casualties, Allied. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle for US forces during World War II. A preliminary army report restricted to the 1st and 3rd US armies listed 75,482 casualties, 8,407 killed, 46,170 wounded, and 20,905 missing. British the 30th Corps losses to 17th January 1945 were recorded as 1,408, 200 killed, 969 wounded, and 239 missing. T.N. Dupuy, David Bongard, and Richard Anderson list battle casualties for XXX Corps combat units as 1,462, including 222 killed, 977 wounded, and 263 missing to 16th January 1945 inclusive. Casualties among American divisions, excluding attached elements, corps and Army-level combat support and rear area personnel, totaled 62,439 from 16th of December 1944 to 16th of January 1945, inclusive. 6,238 killed, 32,712 wounded, and 23,399 missing. Historian Charles B. MacDonald lists 81,000 American casualties, 41,315 during the defensive phase, and 39,672 during the drive to flatten the Bulge through 28th of January. An official report by the United States Department of the Army lists 105,102 casualties for the entire Ardennes-Alsace campaign, including 19,246 killed, 62,489 wounded, and 26,612 captured or missing. This number incorporates losses not just for the Battle of the Bulge, but also all losses suffered during the period by units with the Ardennes-Alsace battle credit, the entirety of US 1st, 3rd, and 7th Armies, which includes losses suffered during the German offensive in Alsace, Operation Nordwind, as well as forces engaged in the Saar and Lorraine campaigns, and the Battle of Hurtgen Forest during that time period. For the period of December 1944 January 1945 on the entire Western Front. Forrest Pogue gives a total of 28,178 US military personnel captured, including shot-down airmen. German. The German High Command estimated that they lost between 81,134 and 98,024 men on the Western Front between 16th of December 1944 and 25th of January 1945. The accepted figure was 81,834, of which 12,752 were killed, 38,600 were wounded, and 30,582 were missing. Allied estimates on German casualties range from 81,000 to 103,900. Some authors have estimated German casualties as high as 125,000. T.N. Dupuy's estimates, based on fragmentary German records and oral testimony, suggest casualties among divisions and brigades alone, excluding attached elements, corps and army-level combat support, and rear area personnel, totaled 74,559 from 16th of December 1944 to 16th January 1945, inclusive 11,048 killed, 34,168 wounded, and 29,243 missing. German historian Hermann Jung lists 67,675 casualties from 16th of December 1944 to late January 1945 for the three German armies that participated in the offensive. The German casualty reports for the involved armies count 63,222 losses from 10th December 1944 to 31st January 1945. The United States Army Center of Military History's official numbers are 75,000 American casualties and 100,000 German casualties. Christa Bergstrom lists between 527 and 554 losses to all causes among German tanks, tank destroyers and assault guns during the campaign, of which 324 were lost in combat. Of the German write-offs, 1620 were Tigers, 191 194 Panthers, 141 158 Panzer IVs, and 179 the 182 were tank destroyers and assault guns. Hermann Jung gave figures for 600 German tanks across the entire Western Front from 16th of December 1944 to 1st February 1945. Other sources placed German losses in the range of 600-800. Magna E. Bauer's review of OKW records suggests 324 losses in December, 77 Panzer IVs, 132 Panthers, 13 Tigers, and 102 assault guns, and even more in January. American losses over the same period were similarly heavy, totaling from 733 tanks and tank destroyers, exclusive of other types and losses suffered by British the 30th Corps, to 800 in tanks alone. Result: although the Germans managed to begin their offensive with complete surprise and enjoyed some initial successes, they were not able to seize the initiative on the Western Front. While the German command did not reach its goals, the Ardennes operation inflicted heavy losses and set back the Allied invasion of Germany by several weeks. The High Command of the Allied forces had planned to resume the offensive by early January 1945, after the wet season rains and severe frosts, but those plans had to be postponed until 29th of January 1945 in connection with the unexpected changes in the front. The Allies pressed their advantage following the battle. By the beginning of February 1945, the lines were roughly where they had been in December 1944. In early February, the Allies launched an attack all along the Western Front. In the north, under Montgomery, they fought Operation Veritable, also known as the Battle of the Reichswald. East of Aachen, they fought the second phase of the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, in the center under Hodges, and in the south under Patton. The German losses in the battle were especially critical. Their last reserves were now gone, the Luftwaffe had been shattered, and remaining forces throughout the West were being pushed back to defend the Siegfried Line. In response to the early success of the offensive, on 6th of January, Churchill contacted Stalin to request that the Soviets put pressure on the Germans on the Eastern Front. On 12th of January, the Soviets began the massive Vistula-Oder offensive, originally planned for 20th of January. It had been brought forward from 20th of January to 12th of January because meteorological reports warned of a thaw later in the month, and the tanks needed hard ground for the offensive. And the advance of the Red Army was assisted by two panzer armies, 5th and 6th, being redeployed for the Ardennes attack. Churchill was elated at Stalin's offer of help, thanking Stalin for the thrilling news. During World War II, most US black soldiers still served only in maintenance or service positions, or in segregated units. Because of troop shortages during the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower decided to integrate the service for the first time. This was an important step toward a desegregated United States military. More than 2,000 black soldiers had volunteered to go to the front. A total of 708 Black Americans were killed in combat during World War II. The Germans officially referred to the offensive by the codename Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, while the Allies designated it the Ardennes counteroffensive. The phrase Battle of the Bulge was coined by contemporary press to describe the bulge in German front lines on wartime news maps, and it became the most widely used name for the battle. The offensive was planned by the German forces with utmost secrecy, with minimal radio traffic and movements of troops and equipment under cover of darkness. Intercepted German communications, indicating a substantial German offensive preparation, were not acted upon by the Allies. Media attention. The battle around Bastogne received a great deal of media attention because in early December 1944, it was a rest and recreation area for many war correspondents. The rapid advance by the German forces who surrounded Bastogne, the spectacular resupply operations via parachute and glider, along with the fast action of General Patton's 3rd US Army, all were featured in newspaper articles and on radio and captured the public's imagination. There were no correspondents in the area of St. Vith, Elsenborn or Monschauhofen. Bletchley Park post-mortem missed indicators. At Bletchley Park, F.L. Lucas and Peter Calvocoressi of Hut 3 were tasked by General Nye, as part of the inquiry set up by the Chiefs of Staff, with writing a report on the lessons to be learned from the handling of pre-battle Ultra. The report concluded that the costly reverse might have been avoided if Ultra had been more carefully considered. Ultra intelligence was plentiful and informative, though not wholly free from ambiguity, but it was misread and misused. Lucas and Calvocoressi noted that intelligence staffs had been too apt to assume that Ultra would tell them everything. Among the signs misread were the formation of the new 6th Panzer Army in the build-up area, west bank of the Rhine about Cologne, the new STAR, Signals Control Network, noted by the Fusion Room traffic analysts, linking all the armoured divisions assembling in the build-up area, including some transferred from the Russian front, the daily aerial reconnaissance of the lightly defended target area by new Arado R-234 jets, as a matter of greatest urgency, the marked increase in railway traffic in the build-up area, the movement of 1,000 trucks from the Italian front to the build-up area, disproportionate anxiety about tiny hitches in troop movements, suggesting a tight timetable, the quadrupling of Luftwaffe fighter forces in the west, and decrypts of Japanese diplomatic signals from Berlin to Tokyo, mentioning the coming offensive. SHAEF failures. For its part, Hut 3 had grown shy of going beyond its job of amending and explaining German messages. Drawing broad conclusions was for the intelligence staff at SHAEF, who had information from all sources, including aerial reconnaissance. Lucas and Calvocoressi added that it would be interesting to know how much reconnaissance was flown over the Eifel sector on the US 1st Army front. E.J.N. Rose, head air advisor in Hut 3, read the paper at the time and described it in 1998 as an extremely good report that showed the failure of intelligence at SHAEF and at the Air Ministry. Lucas and Calvocoressi expected heads to roll at Eisenhower's HQ, but they did no more than wobble. 5 copies of a report by the Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, Indications of the German Offensive of December 1944, derived from Ultra material, submitted to DMI, were issued on 28 December 1944. Copy number 2 is held by the UK National Archives as file HW 13-45. It sets out the various indications of an impending offensive that were received, then offers conclusions about the wisdom conferred by hindsight, the dangers of becoming wedded to a fixed view of the enemy's likely intentions, over-reliance on source, i.e. Ultra, and improvements in German security. It also stresses the role played by poor Allied security. The Germans have this time prevented us from knowing enough about them, but we have not prevented them knowing far too much about us. Battle credit. After the war ended, the US Army issued battle credit in the form of the Ardennes-Alsace campaign citation to units and individuals that took part in operations in Northwest Europe. The citation covered troops in the Ardennes sector where the main battle took place, as well as units further south in the Alsace sector, including those in the northern Alsace who filled in the vacuum created by the US 3rd Army racing north, engaged in the concurrent Operation Nordwind diversion in central and southern Alsace, launched to weaken Allied response in the Ardennes, and provided reinforcements to units fighting in the Ardennes. That's the complete article. If you made it this far, you'll love the rest of the channel. Subscribe for a new Wikipedia deep dive every single day. The next video is on screen now, and if there's a topic you want narrated, drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.